co-writers of the film. I directed it with my husband, Sławomir Grünberg, and we finished the film in 2011, and this was really the third LGBTQ project that we did in Poland.
Richard Mole, I'm a senior lecturer in political sociology here. For most of my academic career, I actually worked on the Soviet Union and the former Soviet Union. I became interested in Poland about 10 years ago when I was taking part in two separate projects, one on migration and one on homophobia.
I'm very grateful to UCL and Play Out and eMigrating Landscapes for inviting this film to screen here.
My name is Katarzyna Perlak. I'm a London-based mixed media artist. My background is in philosophy and in arts, which I studied both in Poland and in London. And my practice was originated from photography, but then I moved to video, to spatial practice. And also I work with text. There is one of my works. And the subjects that I'm interested in different subjects that are related to social change and to how art is the relation of art and activism. Activism is also my background.
Events like this are essential for raising awareness about the situation for gays and lesbians, trans and bisexual people in Poland, but also it resonates with individuals throughout the world, not just in Europe.
Just very briefly about myself, my research area is social change and migration in and from Poland. And my role tonight is simply to be chairing the discussion, and we are hoping to have at least half an hour of free discussion after Richard has given his short talk about his research. Then we'll open the floor to questions, and I hope lots of you will want to participate in that. Thank you.
There's a big interest in these issues from the Polish community, and not just the Polish LGBTQ community. The issues of LGBTQ rights in Poland are very interesting for all.
I think it's really important that we do gather and discuss the queer issues.
In 2008, we were asked by an American segment of PBS called In the Life, which is an LGBTQ segment, to make a short film about gay life in Poland.
For me, the most important way of changing people's minds, of making people more tolerant, more accepting, is through visibility. So when films like this show the personal stories of individuals, I think it can have a much more meaningful impact than simply sort of reading about articles in a newspaper.
You could hardly find people who would appear in front of a camera to talk about what it's like to be gay in Poland. 3 years later. In the meantime, we did Transaction about Ania Grodzka, which is our transgender project. 3 years later, we had to refuse people. There were so many people who wanted to be in our film. We had to tell them, sorry, we already have we already have too many. But that was the idea. We wanted to make a grander sort of, not a short, but we wanted to show a spectrum of life. And also, if you watch the shorts that we did for PBS, it's pretty depressing.
When you're sort of watching a young man whose boyfriend hanged himself because he was not accepted by his family, things like this will have much more of an impact on changing people's minds than any other medium.
This one, if any criticism that we got for this film, the most criticism was it's a little too happy. But it wasn't editing. That's what it was like. And in 2011, right before before Europride in Warsaw, this was the atmosphere. This is what we got from people. And of course, it's not 100% happy. So, and then when we finished this film, Robert Biedroń, who's in the film, and Ania Grodzka were elected to the parliament. So already, when we were screening the first screenings of this film, we're already a little outdated. Hello, it's even better now. So the changes in Poland are so, just incredibly dynamic. When things, happen over a period of 30 years as opposed to since the 60s to now, it's just so much more dense. And it happens both in Jewish life and in gay life in Poland. That's why we're so interested.
Great opportunity for people to exchange their experiences and also initiate a dialogue, how we can improve situation.
I'm sure we've all got lots and lots to say, but let's hand over to Richard first.
A couple of things that I've been researching that your documentary just illustrated beautifully, whether it was sort of intentionally so or not. And one of the things that struck me was the protesters were wrapping themselves in Polish flags, waving Polish flags. And this is something that I've been interested in, is sort of trying to work out why nationalists in particular have such an issue with homosexuality. I've even met Polish atheists who still claim to be Catholic, because if you're Polish, you're Catholic. Whether you believe in God is actually sort of by the by, you know, if you're Polish or Catholic. But I sort of attended a couple of sort of pride marches throughout Eastern Europe, particularly in the Baltic states. And again, this idea that you can't be gay and sort of a good member of the nation. My favourite sign was in Latvia. There was a protester holding a sign which said, "More gays, fewer Latvians," which initially I thought was a good idea. But what he was making this equation that you can't be gay and Latvian, because if you're sort of gay, then you're sort of you're a bad member of the nation. And so the main argument is obviously this idea that gays and lesbians don't have babies, therefore then they're sort of they're not contributing to the future of the nation.
And if they do, they corrupt the babies.
Absolutely, they're the wrong kind of babies, yes. In particular, I sort of heard an interesting argument that if lesbians have babies, then the father's name isn't passed on. And this is sort of very important for sort of the continuation of nations. And in Russia, you know, you have a patronymic. What do you do if there's sort of, where's the patronymic come from? So you can't have proper, I mean, this was in the Russian context. Also this idea that that the gays are to blame for falling birth rates, which I always find a very interesting argument, because it's an argument that sort of people hold quite firmly and believe in, but obviously analytically it's absolute nonsense. If the birth rate is falling, then the gays can't actually do a great deal about it. It's, you know, you should be talking to the heterosexuals to have more babies if if you want to raise the birth rate. But that sort of logical sequence doesn't seem to follow through. And also this idea, association of homosexuality with Westernness is something that sort of came up again and again in my research. The fact that a lot of the support for sort of gay pride events comes from the West, comes from the EU, Western embassies, it sort of reinforces this idea, and therefore it sort of opens up gay people to accusations of being traitors. They sort of look to Brussels rather than to Warsaw or to Moscow. And these sort of ideas. Also, the nation has very clear sort of gender roles. You know, you have the woman who is the mother, who sort of has the babies, who passes on the culture, who looks after the home, and then you have the man who goes out and fights for the nation. And so gays and lesbians again sort of confuse, problematize these very stereotypical ideas of what the men and the role that men and women should play in the nation. The other point that I thought was really interesting, and which a number of your respondents brought up, was this idea of visibility and invisibility. One of the students said very early on that in high school you never hear about homosexuality. Even at university, that young woman said that only one professor had said the H word, as she put it. And so that I thought was sort of very interesting. And then when gays and lesbians are actually sort of represented, it's these sort of stereotypical, sexualized, negative images. And this is why coming out, to sort of come to the title of your film, is so important. And so this has sort of been a problem. I mean, I was sort of looking at comparing Russia and the United States, and in Russia, for example, only 7% of the population admits that they have ever met a gay or a lesbian, or sort of personally acquainted, whereas in North America and the United States it's over 50%. And so by coming out, by sort of breaking down these stereotypes, by showing that you can be a teacher and a lesbian, as that woman did, is the most effective way of sort of changing people's mindsets. And this sort of links to my other strand of my research, which is on migration, because I think one of the reasons that attitudes in Poland have changed so much is that so many Poles leave Poland, sort of work in sort of other countries where the media representation of gay people is perhaps a bit more sort of open, a bit more positive, or at least neutral, where they're more likely to come into contact with gay people. And we, colleagues and I at UCL did research. We did a survey of 3,500 East European migrants in London and asked them about their attitudes towards homosexuality. And we found that the longer these people were in the UK, the more tolerant they were towards homosexuality. Over a 4-year period, and then it sort of plateaued. Actually, there was a sort of a spike when they first arrived where they actually got a bit more homophobic. And we thought that maybe that was just sort of being confronted with so many gay people at once or something. We weren't quite sure. Or perhaps when they sort of arrive, they tend to sort of congregate even more with members of their own nationality, and it sort of reinforces ideas rather than breaks them down. But when we sort of interviewed people, we found that people admitted to having been quite homophobic. I mean, there was a former policeman who said he would sort of go out and sort of, if they were bored, they would just go out and pick on the sort of the gay people. But he said over here, he said, you know, I sort of made friends with these people. We became really good friends, and after a year, I found out that he was gay, and then it was too late to hate him, as he put it. And this was something you heard again and again. That's very often they said, you know, they only met gay people for the first time in London. And you know what? They were just like you and me. Yes, they weren't sort of all sort of wearing sort of harnesses and however they were sort of portrayed in the media at home. And so it was this sort of personal contact, this visibility that had the biggest impact on people's attitudes. And then they'd sort of go home and they would sort of take these attitudes back with them.
Now, perhaps what we can do is have questions and discussion. I'm sure some of you just want to make general points, not to ask a question. That's fine. Or you might have a question to ask of a specific member of the panel. That's fine too. We'll just see how it goes. I'll try to be fair. Please, can you put your hand up if you want to speak, and I'll try and take people in order. So who'd like to start?
There was a lot of interest in the audience about actually seeing these parallels, seeing this sort of strange solidarity that LGBTQ people and Jews have in Poland. Perhaps this, you know, common issue of coming out still today as Jewish and as gay in Poland is to be blamed for this.
So on the movie, what I found really interesting, and it was something I didn't really think about before, is something that really transpired from when you interviewed people talking about their relations with their parents. And each time the recurring trend was this mother who was accepting or sort of okay with it, and the father who was revolted and left the room or started swearing at gay people, apart from this one case of, I think towards the end, where the girl said that the father came up and hugged her. And that's something that's really interesting and perhaps brings up questions of whether maybe in the discourse in Poland it isn't gay identity versus Polishness, but more gay identity versus traditional masculine sort of imagining of what a Pole should be like. And it's just an interesting dynamic that this movie made me think of. And the question, I'm wondering, in your research, Richard, on the immigrants, did you also look at the old immigrant groups in UK, the people who came pre-2004? And I wonder whether there was any difference between their attitudes and the people who came after 2004 and the more recent wave.
It's very short. No, we didn't. We just sort of looked at people who arrived in 2004. So they were predominantly sort of much younger. Sort of the vast majority of migrants are sort of young anyway, and so we didn't have that sort of comparison because there wasn't much. We thought that the new Poles and the old Poles might interact more than they actually do.
I really don't know if there's a pattern, and I also don't think that there's a way to suggest that there is without actually going into gender stereotypes myself. You know, I could tell you what, the mother will be a little more sensitive because she's a woman, you know, or she will be more forgiving. Whatever sort of rationalization we'll come up with will be gender stereotypes. I think it's very individual, and I think, you know, it came up in the film this way. But I really don't know what the statistics are. I'm sure you know somebody will one day be brave enough to try and maneuver you know, with the gender stereotypes and find out an answer for that. But.
Okay, perhaps somebody else would like to ask a couple. Yes, go ahead.
I'm representing Polish Rainbow in UK, which is the Polish migrants LGBT group in London. A couple of things. You, Katke, said something about it's the same as, you know, being an invisible gay. People think that, oh, you will never met a gay person.
Something that struck me the most is that you had the mix of different people as not only a Polish community, so it's good to see that people have a dialogue between different experiences and how this can reflect on the dialogue on queer issues in Poland at the moment.
I work with Polish gay, lesbian, queer people, and lots of them feel so comfortable here that they don't really want to gather together and do anything. They feel like, oh, it's fine here. But then when you ask them to appear in a little feature for a mainstream Polish TV, they'd be like, oh, no, my grandma will see it in Poland, so I cannot be there. So there is another part of their life. There is immigrants who left Poland because it was so bad to live there. They actually decided to move. That's probably another, at least an hour discussion. But yeah, lots of them feel here so comfortable, they don't even want to fight. But then when it comes to appear as gay in Poland, they still have this double identity.
I'm born Polish and I've grown up in Sweden. I came out in 93. And I find that Polish people who've lived overseas for a long time are far more conservative than people who live in Poland. So I've had to come out twice. I had to come out in Sweden as gay and then come out in my own Polish community. So it was like a double thing. And when I actually went to visit Poland, I found people far more open and less homophobic within the Polish community than the Polish people who've lived, in Sweden or the UK for 40 years. And they've given my parents, like the church community, the Polonia, they've been giving my parents grief because I'm gay. And that just, all these, it's really weird that the Polish people who have lived overseas for a really long time, they've conserved the kind of Polish conservatism that no longer is Poland. And I think it's a next chapter in research how that is. But I find that Poland is far more open than I expected it to be myself, based on my parents, and yeah, it's just a remark too.
I just want to ask you a question, all of you. So, we've seen two before this documentary, which I really enjoyed, which actually happened to be the first out of the 3 movies I was going to mention. We've seen Małgorzata Szumowska's In the Name of, the priest story, the gay priest story in Poland. That was, I think, 2 years old, and then we were showing this year Floating Skyscrapers, about another story. Both of them I felt somehow grim, because like the priest story goes back into the Catholic closet or whatever. It perpetuates the story. Then in the Floating Skyscrapers, the one of the main characters gets killed, and that's a bit of a, the bubble gets burst, really, very sadly. In this documentary, I felt there was that kind of breath of hope, and you even mentioned that it seems like the situation is changing. My personal experiences from my little small hometown in Poland, with my granny being all supportive and my mom making like pancakes for my boyfriend and stuff. It's nice, but I still I'm not quite sure. Every time I go back to Poland, I kind of like observe and see what's going on, and it's very kind of mixed up. My feelings are very mixed up. I wanted to ask you, like, seriously, what is your, which way do you think it will be going? Like, do you think as they say that maybe in a couple of years, a decade maybe, we will be able to like get married there, for example, or is it absolutely? Because I personally think it's going to take another 50 years at least. What do you think?
I gotta tell you that I became a lot more optimistic than I was since Ania Grodzka got into the parliament. When she told us, we became friends when we made the film about her. I mean, she calls us her godparents. I mean, we held her hand during her surgery. We were the only people there with her. We're close friends. She told us she was going to run for government. We looked at each other. We said, "Oh my God, poor thing." I mean, she's very sensitive. We thought, "Oh my, this is going to be terrible. They're going to kill her. I mean, she's going to get so much hate mail. She's going to be in such trouble. Why is she doing this to herself?" Seriously, this was our reaction. And then when she got in, we were like, what?
And in Krakow.
In
of all
Krakow,
places.
of all
places.
places, the most traditional conservative of large cities in Poland. I mean, unbelievable. So when you say it's going to take another 50 years, I think you're probably wrong. I mean,
what was the follow-up of these two politicians who kind of, before Biedroń was so kind of active and would talk about gay issues, and I don't know, maybe I'm not following up closely enough, but I think the discussion
there is
kind
a
of
struggle. There's a lot that needs to be done. There's a lot that's just not getting done.
It's not happen overnight,
it's not happening overnight, and it won't. But the fact that we have in Poland the only transgender MP, in the world right now is a little incredible.
Maybe there's this little internalized homophobia within me, which kind of fears that it's not going to happen.
Like, although these things are happening, it is terrible what's happening to her every day. I spoke with her as well. I don't know her as well as you do, but if people spit on her in the corridors in the parliament, like physically spit on her, and these are politicians. So you have these things, it's very open, but also you get, the more people are coming out, the more the extremist people feel that they can do whatever they want. And I'm not sure how that's going to be worked on, but Poland being in the European Union and being a more and more Polish living overseas and coming back home, it has to change. I don't think there is no road back.
In a context of the whole gender setup in Poland and the whole way the gender division was created and how it was always created in a sort of national context of uprisings and partitions and the war and the communism and so on. So the Polish identity is very much built in opposition to something, so it does need a bit this enemy sort of to define itself. And I thought that it's not so much that women are more tolerant, but women are in charge of the sort of private spaces, and being gay in private is not threatening to national identity in any way. So it doesn't, in a way, I think, threaten any sort of order. So they can afford, making pancakes. They can afford being more tolerant, I think, because they have their own tour where they have no much power, but they have power over this. And I think maybe with sort of more women's rights and sort of more women's feminist movement expanding, this sort of sphere will expand as well.
Have you, in your documentaries, in your research or in your art, have you come across or talk to people who are migrants to Poland, so coming from other countries, from Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, America, etc., coming to Europe with their own preconceptions of what gay and heterosexuality is and whether they are gay or heterosexual, and how did they experience life in Poland?
There even is one person that actually speaks on camera who's American, and he's living in Poland for many years, and another guy who just only appears in the background who's Slovak, and he lives in Poland in a very interesting relationship with a transgender person. I'm not sure what your question is, and I don't.
For example, if someone comes from a Western European country, moves to Poland,
Yeah.
do they suddenly hide themselves more, or do they just keep, to behave exactly the same way?
Not the ones I know. No, the ones I know are actually involved, and maybe that's why I know them. So there might be others that I don't. But there was an article a few days ago that said that Warsaw is looking to become the next Berlin. Also in the sense of all Israeli gays and lesbians moving to Berlin. This is this big trend. Now they're actually saying this might happen to Warsaw in the near future. So it's that's a very optimistic article.
I'm moving with that.
The first thing that you think of is that actually whatever you'd known about divisions between East and West may not actually cut it as much as you thought it would be. At the same time, you also realise that you yourself, moving from a Western country to Warsaw, to Poland, whatever that, or any other place, you're a very privileged person. And in that position, you don't need to come out. You can just find your own community. Your community's already there.
I've been here for quite a while. And myself, when I was in Poland, I didn't consider myself queer. I came to this realization in the queer community here in London. So my experience of coming out is very different to the people that have lived in Poland or were in Poland when they came to to realize that. Anyhow, so me being here, becoming a queer person, then making work in relation to this, I went to an art residency where I met Julie Land, and she's a curator working in an academic working in Krakow, and herself she came from States, and she's queer, and she's like very active on a queer scene in Krakow, was involved with the queer festival, invited me to show my work there. So I find it very interesting, like person from States come to Krakow, then they like contribute their experience from States, then I go here, we meet in Germany, and how all this gets linked. So I think it's very significant how opening, how joining EU and immigration brings more openness and more knowledge and dialogue. It's really a beautiful experience that you have created this platform for people to discuss those issues in here.
You're saying that people who go there, they go to Warsaw, but they do not go to smaller towns. Warsaw is like London and small town in Yorkshire. That's the difference. Or in Wales or somewhere. I think in terms of homophobia and tolerance and what's his name? The Jew gay guy? Maciek. He said, in Warsaw people are so busy, they don't, pardon my language, give a, damn about it. Like where I lived, lots of people were moving to Warsaw because it was easier. Life is so, there's so many people, the scene is easier. And that's the same thing. When you go to Warsaw, you don't see that struggle as you could see in the smaller towns. Second thing, I think the society is more accepting than politicians. If it was up to politicians, it would probably take another half century. Because the current government promised it twice, they will have a bill, and it was never read in the parliament. That said, I think this social change which is happening in a local election, lots of people come out. That will be like, I think for me, it will be like a test drive. If people will vote gays into local council, what's wrong with them? Maybe the main government, the parliament will see there's nothing wrong with it. And finally, at least one of 3 bills for civil partnership will be read in Parliament. And I think that these are the 2 things I wanted to say.
If I can just add quickly to this, I think that unfortunately we can't separate the politics and the religion in Poland, and how the Catholic Church and their position towards queer people and LGBTQ community is. And just recently I heard that the recent Pope, he was trying to introduce some new changes. This didn't happen, but I think hopefully this go forward as well, and then this influence things in Poland, because I think the church is much more powerful.
The church is losing power in Poland. I think it's
well,
losing.
I hope so.
There's a hardcore believers, but there's lots of people who disagree.
Having discussions after films like this is also very important. It gives people the opportunity to tell their own story. Sometimes this may be the first opportunity they've had to discuss issues such as homosexuality, homophobia, intolerance.
These things will change. I think people will say no to ultra-conservative church because it will be just so outdated. I can see that changing within even my mom, who votes, law and justice in Poland.
Being able to discuss your own story is can be very cathartic, and often will create a sense of community among people who've gone through the same thing. They may think that if they've grown up in a small town in the middle of Poland, that they were the only people who've experienced this sort of abuse, who've sort of gone through these types of processes. Therefore, not just sort of having talking heads at the front, discussing their research, discussing their films, but giving everybody the opportunity to be part of the event, I think is also very important.
It's 9:15. It might be a good idea to move to the room where we're going to have the reception, so we can go and
There's
talk
wine,
in there.
apparently.
Yes.
very much.